Hello there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and today we're going to be talking about choking. Now, when I say choking, I'm not talking about that like you've eaten something that's too big for you and you didn't chew enough. If you aren't chewing enough, the most effective strategy you need to use is chew more and chew better. It's just like I try to tell people to believe better, well, chew better. And if you do that, okay, if you do that, this will help you to ensure that you do not choke. So that could be the end of the episode right there, but it's not. Why? Because when I talk about choking, I'm not talking about that. I'm not also talking about how to stop choking, as in if you like to choke people, which I hope none of my listeners are in that situation. I'm not talking about choking other people either. What I'm talking about is choking when we perform. And when you're an athlete, when you're a public speaker, when you're going to an interview, when you're on a date, all of those are situations where people can sometimes get what we call the yips, or they can find themselves choking. This is when you feel very anxious, and as a result of that, that can negatively impede and negatively impact your ability to be able to perform at that moment in time. So what I want to do is offer you an understanding as to what goes on in the brain whenever we choke. Why do we choke the way in which we do? And hopefully by doing so, provide you with a number of different skills that you can use to avoid choking moving forward. But we'll start by understanding, why do we choke and why do we do it sometimes at the absolute worst moments? Well, first of all, choking itself is something that happens from a neurobiological perspective, a neurochemical perspective, largely as a result of the chemical known as cortisol. And cortisol is a chemical also known as the stress hormone, but it's something that's released in our bodies every single morning just after we've woken up, right? Around the time that we wake up, cortisol is released and gets us to pay attention. It activates us. It gets our focus and gets us to start to pay attention to the world. It requires metabolic release, requires us to be able to use calories, to be able to start the day, to be able to take action. And whenever we're stressed out about something, cortisol is released into our system. Now, the difference between cortisol and, let's say, norepinephrine or noradrenaline, or adrenaline, or also known as epinephrine, the difference is that with adrenaline, for example, it's a flight or fight response. So our brain starts to impact the way in which our heart is beating, the way in which we're breathing. We are in that state of flight or fight or fright. And generally speaking, it becomes very intense very quickly, but then after a short while, we then get back to normal. Whereas cortisol is something that keeps us on edge a much longer period of time. So what's vital is that we need to recognize when we are experiencing this notion of stress and anxiety and understand how it might impact the way in which we are performing at any moment in time. So this impact occurs whenever cortisol itself influences or impacts some of the different areas of the brain. Cortisol can interfere with and affect the way in which our prefrontal cortex, also known as our PFC, acts. And the prefrontal cortex is just right behind the forehead here. It's the frontal part of our brain. It's usually identified or associated with making decisions. Now, making decisions and thinking rationally and thinking logically and figuring out and solving problems is the produce of a number of elements or number of parts of the brain, a whole network, set of networks in the brain. But one of the parts that tends to be associated quite a lot with a lot of the logical reasoning is this prefrontal cortex. And why this matters is that when we do find ourselves feeling this anxiety, it can often interfere with our ability to think things through. So in other words, when we choke, it's very hard for us to think our way out of the situation because the very emotion, the very chemical of cortisol is influencing and affecting our ability to be able to think things through in that context. And that's why so often just thinking everything is going to be fine won't always work quite well whenever we're in that situation. It also can interfere or influence areas of the brain like the basal ganglia or the cerebellum, which are responsible for the more habitual automatic skills that we've learned. And in many ways, cortisol can affect the retrieval of not just memories or episodic memory, which is an example of memories where we remember certain situations happening, or semantic memory where we remember the meaning of words or the meaning of terms or the meaning of something, but also procedural memory. And procedural memory is really the memories that we have that are our unconscious abilities to be able to do things. So your unconscious skills to be able to do things. What happens is that whenever we start to choke, whenever we start to get stressed in that moment, we stop letting it be automatic and we start to self-monitor. So in other words, we start to become very conscious of what we're doing. We become conscious of the feeling of fear, conscious of the restrictions we feel, and conscious of what we're doing. And the problem is that kind of almost starts to reverse the process of learning. So the process of learning, generally speaking, starts with unconscious incompetence, where we don't know what we can't do. Then there's conscious incompetence, when we're aware of what we can't do. Then there's conscious competence, when we're focusing on it, we're conscious about what we can do. And finally, there's unconscious competence. That is where we don't even need to think about it. It just becomes natural to us. Whenever we start to choke, what happens is we start to become more conscious and more aware of what we're doing at that moment in time, which in turn is where the conscious competence comes into play. And conscious competence and, I suppose, conscious incompetence are very closely aligned. So it's very easy for us to make mistakes when we're thinking too much about what we're doing at that moment in time. Increased stress and anxiety can disrupt the smooth execution of these kind of movements, the automatic, practice movements that we engage in on an ongoing basis. Also, choking can negatively impact our long-term memory, our ability to be able to remember things long-term, and can negatively affect the way in which we perform in the future as well. Why? Because when you have a negative traumatic experience where, for example, there's high stakes and you fail to succeed in that situation, that could be something that your brain brings back, saying, oh, well, this is to be scared of. Remember the last time you choked? Oh, you don't want to choke again. And as we well know, when we tell ourselves, you don't want to be doing this again, or don't choke, don't choke, don't choke, well, that doesn't help. It's like me telling you, don't think of a green elephant snorting cocaine off the back of a donkey. You weren't thinking about it until I told you. I don't know why I was thinking about it. I shouldn't be thinking about it. That's not the kind of thought that I want in my head. It's ridiculous. And why would an elephant do that, right? And why would it be green? It was in a parade and just paint it green. None of this makes sense. Therefore, it doesn't make sense for us to tell ourselves just not to choke, because the more we tell ourselves, oh, I don't want this to happen again, the more likely it is to actually happen. So we do not want that to affect us in this way. Well, instead, we want to understand is, well, what are the factors that influence and impact the level of cortisol in our systems? Because once we understand these factors, maybe we can do something about those. And the first factor that influences the level of cortisol and how that cortisol affects us is our mindset, our beliefs about what the feeling of anxiety or feeling of stress means. And there's two different mindsets we can have when it comes to stress. One is when we think stress is bad for us, and the other is what is known as a stress is enhancing mindset. And so we think about stress as something that helps us, something that empowers us, something that ensures that we're in the best possible frame of mind. Simply holding that mindset can allow us to feel differently about the stressful situations when we experience them. And it also has been shown to trigger the release of a chemical known as DHEA, which actually helps us to be better at being able to handle stress and anxiety when they occur. And so your mindset about stress, having a stress is enhancing mindset as recommended by great research done by the likes of Professor Alia Crum and Professor Kelly McGonigal, what we've learned is that the mindsets that we hold about the stress that we experience plays a large part in determining how well we perform or how well we function with that stress. So in other words, when you see this as something that's okay and something that can help you, it's more likely to help you in that situation. And it's really down to how we interpret it in that context. And so what's vital is to recognize that whenever you're in a situation where you're stressed, oftentimes what happens is that we have two types of nervous systems that kick in. You have the parasympathetic nervous system, which kicks in whenever you're relaxed. And you've got the sympathetic nervous system, which is what is activated whenever we're under stress. This is what triggers the release of adrenaline and cortisol from our amygdala, which is the part of our brain, which is often associated with our response to fear. But it does a lot more than that. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But suffice to say for now that the amygdala is triggered by the triggering of the sympathetic nervous system. And as a result, it affects our physiology. It means that we're breathing faster, our heart beats faster, blood flows around to our extremities, and it's trying to give us the resources we need, the metabolic resources we need to be able to handle the situation so we can survive. The problem is those metabolic resources aren't always useful for us to have full access to when we're in the middle of certain types of performance. So if we change our mindset about what it means and how these can help us to be ready, then that can in turn empower us to be able to be at our best in the situation. The second factor that can influence how cortisol affects us is timing. If we're in a situation where everything is good and then all of a sudden something shakes us up and makes us panic, then the gap between us feeling good and panicking is pretty large. And therefore, it's more likely to cripple us in that context mentally to the point we're not as likely to perform as well as we want. And so if you're already in a situation that you're highly alert, if you're already in a situation that you're already nervous, because the gap between being really nervous and choking is not that far away from each other, it means that if you start to choke, you're less likely to have it impact you as significantly. Because once again, there's a big difference between going all the way from being okay to panicking than there is from being very highly stressed to panic. What does that suggest to us? It suggests the importance of us getting comfortable in nervous situations. So getting comfortable with being able to make it so that we can trigger the release of the right kind of chemicals to allow us to handle it whenever we're in that situation. So if you find yourself in a very relaxed place, that you can comfortably navigate your way into and out of a stress state quite easily. And by you being able to mentally rehearse things not going the way you want it to go, that can be an advantage for you. That can really empower you to be able to do that. There's also the duration of the stress, the release of this chemical. Over time, if we keep experiencing stress, then that can become toxic for us. And so what you want to do is figure out ways to be able to completely relax, figure out ways to be able to trigger the relaxing chemicals, allowing you to release and let go of any of the stress or tension in your body so that you can be free from cortisol for periods of time. By doing so, you provide yourself with the opportunity to be able to relax and feel much better as a result. There's also the intensity of the impact. Sometimes it's not just the cortisol, it's the level in your system, could even be mixed in with some adrenaline as well. And if it's too intense and too high, then that becomes something that makes even more of a stamp in terms of that makes us feel even stronger in this situation and even easier to remember, which is not necessarily something we want to be able to do that well for the times where things don't go well. So we once again have to learn how we can reduce the intensity of this emotion. And that is by using techniques, physiological techniques largely, that can help us to reduce how we feel at that moment in time. And again, we're going to talk about those in a few moments. The final one is really a combination of all these factors, which is our overall stress tolerance. How good are you at being under pressure? Personally, I'm good at being under pressure, and I had to develop that skill. The first few times that I spoke in public, I was terrified. I was stuttering, I was stammering, I was shaking, I was sweaty. My sweat was getting on the index cards where I was reading my speech on. I was a nightmare. But in putting myself into those situations, by getting comfortable in those situations, it helped me to be a lot better. Dr. Andrew Huberman, one of the top experts on neuroscience out there, has got a great podcast, The Huberman Lab. Definitely recommend it. Huberman talked about this at a recent talk he gave in New York that I attended. But again, to paraphrase him, one of the most important skills that we need to have is our ability to be able to purposefully engage in stress so that we're able to handle whatever comes our way. We're in both situations. He said, your ability to be flexible, your ability to be able to go from a state of high alert and arousal to a state of calmness is a really great skill to be able to master. If you can go from calmness to alertness and alertness to calmness, and you can perform effectively in both situations, you're going to be in a much more advantageous position. In fact, most of the top warriors out there, like SEAL Team 6 and whatnot, and to become a Navy SEAL in general, you're put in situations where you are on alert. You're put in highly stressful situations so that you can get comfortable with making great decisions in those situations. Now, part of it is to figure out how do we weed out the people that will fold under pressure, but another part is to get people to practice getting better at handling pressure. And over time, you develop a capacity to become more comfortable when you find yourself in a position under pressure. A few years ago, I was doing a talk where I memorized all 15 minutes of the talk. And it was going to be performed in front of a live audience, streamed to 3 or 4 other locations, other cities. So in front of thousands of people at the same time, a lot of pressure on it. And it was a whole rhyme. So in other words, it was a 50-minute poem about the science of wow, how to make people experience a wow effect. And I knew that if I made a mistake at all the way through, it would be an absolute disaster. So the stakes were high for me. And 2 minutes in, sure enough, I dropped a line. I forgot the next line. But instead of panicking, I immediately rhymed my way out of it. In other words, I kept thinking. I gave a couple of lines which I knew rhymed with each other. Like I just came up with lines on the spot that rhymed with each other. And as I did this, in my mind, I'm also thinking, what was the line? What was the line? What was the line? And then I remember the line. I continued the rhyme to the end of the time. Just to keep rhyming now. But I ended up finishing and did a very decent job, very happy with it. But I did almost choke. What made me survive was my belief in my ability to be able to handle it. And because I've developed this belief about who I am, I'm the kind of person who handles pressure well, that in turn increased my stress tolerance and makes me a lot more effective being able to handle whenever the pressure cooker occurs. Some of the psychological factors of choking is that choking can often come from when we overthink, we think too much. Therefore, we lead ourselves astray into the wrong kind of thoughts. Generally, overthinking is not thinking too many thoughts. It's thinking the same thought over and over again to the point where it overwhelms us. So it's imperative that we avoid the possibility of that occurring. It's also important for us to recognize that overthinking is just one way of doing this. We also have the fear of evaluation and judgment, where we're so worried about what other people think. So we need to, again, recognize that this is not something we want. So if we want to handle overthinking, we need to be a lot more effective at being able to finish the negative thoughts that we have. So instead of saying, what if I make a mistake here? What if I choke? Then I will do this. So finishing that thought, not just asking this rhetorical question over and over again, but finishing the thought is a way to do that. If you're looking to be a lot more effective at being able to handle being evaluated or judged, just realize that, look, you could do a great job and people will still not like it. You could do a terrible job and still people will like it. What I've realized is when I've done presentations that I thought to myself, they weren't great, people will come up to me and say, oh my goodness, that was amazing. And similar to, I did my TEDx, which I'm really happy with. And there's a lot of positive feedback, of course, but there's some people who absolutely hate it and think it's terrible. And so I have to be comfortable with, I like it, I'm happy with it, I think it was very good, but not everyone will agree. So even if you do an amazing, perfect job, some people are just going to go, I don't like it, because that's what they're doing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean they're wrong per se. They could be right. But the fact is, not everyone's going to like you. I know there's plenty of people out there that don't like me. I don't understand why. I do understand why. I can give you a litany of reasons as to why, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that they don't. And as a result of that, we need to accept it. Just because they say it doesn't mean it matters as much as you might think. It's also important to recognize when we're getting distracted. Oftentimes, distractions will come and take us away. You'll be in the middle of something and then something distracts you. When you're in an interview situation, for example, and they ask a question out of the blue, or they immediately take a call while they're supposed to be interviewing you, it's important for you to practice getting into the habit of going from distracted to focused, so that you can immediately get focused at a moment's notice. The greatest performers out there have the ability to focus in straight away. You're playing a game of tennis. If you've faulted or you've hit the ball into the net or whatever, you need to be able to bounce back from that immediately. Otherwise, those distracting thoughts can get in your way. There's a very famous snooker player. Snooker is a sport similar to pool that is much more difficult to play. But there's a great professional many years ago, about 20 years ago, or more than that actually, maybe 30 years ago. He was playing in this snooker final, World Snooker Championship final. His name is Jimmy White. And he's a great player. He never won the world championship. But once he was 14 frames to 8 up, and he had to get to 18 frames. And a frame takes about 20 minutes or so, more or less. And he was playing against Stephen Hendry, one of the greatest players of all time. And he lost the game. Stephen Hendry won 10 frames in a row to win 18-14. And when Jimmy talks about what happened to him, he said he started to get distracted. He started to think about who he was going to thank when he had won. And as a result of that, he started to get distracted. And then he made a mistake. And after he made that mistake, he lost a bit of confidence. Stephen Hendry gained confidence. And as a result, he lost. And I remember watching the final many years ago and being devastated for Jimmy. It was an example, very highest level of choking. And it happened, as he described, as a result of distraction. So we need to train ourselves to be able to go, okay, that frame is over. That point is over. That phone call is over. Next, I need to get straight back into focusing. Other things that factor in and influences is sometimes we can be overwhelmed. We're trying to focus too hard and we're trying too hard. So we have an overload of our working memory. That can be something that we need to focus in on and organize better by focusing on what do we want to achieve? What is the goal that we're setting for ourselves? And as a result of focusing on what the goal is that we're setting for ourselves, it can make it easy for us to start to make better decisions as a result of that. We also need to recognize that having experience can help. But if you don't have the experience, that doesn't mean that automatically you're doomed to not be able to handle choking. Simply visualizing yourself choking and what you will do to handle it and putting yourself into the situation where you find yourself under pressure, the more you do that, the more able you'll be to able to handle that nervousness or anxiety whenever it comes up. And learning to train yourself to talk differently using CBT or NLP to change the way you talk to yourself, to use mindfulness to distance yourself from the negative inner voice, that internal dialogue that might tell you, what if this goes wrong or what if that? And instead being able to respond by saying, well, what if it goes right? Let's focus on that instead. And being able to change the trajectory from where your brain is going can oftentimes provide you with what you need to. All of this can be very helpful for you. And then there's overall some techniques that can help. There's your ability to believe in yourself, your capacity, like we talked about, the mindset stuff, but having the right mindset about stress and also having the right belief about you, believing that you are the kind of person that will be able to handle stress and pressure when it occurs. Breathing techniques. There's great stuff. If you want to know more about breathing, read the book by James Nestor. I think it's Breath, and study the work of Wim Hof and some other great experts out there on breathing. By you changing your breathing, it will change your physiology. When you breathe in, your heart beats a little faster. When you breathe out, your heart slows down. Therefore, breathe in, hold it for a few seconds, and then breathe out for longer than you breathed in, and you will start to regulate your nervous system and relax you, hopefully triggering the parasympathetic nervous system. When you practice your posture, you make adjustments with your posture. Once again, it will adjust the way in which you feel. Change your physiology, it will change your feelings. On an earlier podcast episode this season, I talked about the three worlds, the inner world, the outer world, and the somatic world, and that's your body world. And by you making adjustments in terms of your body world, it changes the way you experience your internal sensations. So change your physiology, change your posture, and it will change how you feel at that moment. Use practices like deep relaxation, like yoga nidra, like non-sleep deep rest, like self-hypnosis, like meditation, like mindfulness. All of those will help you to train your nervous system to be able to relax, to train your nervous system to be able to focus. And by doing so, you put yourself in a much more advantageous position to be able to handle stress whenever you experience it. You can also do the opposite. You can expose yourself to cold showers, or you can expose yourself to faster breathing or whatnot. Again, make sure you're supervised in the right way. But you can get yourself with your adrenaline pumping. You can visualize everything going wrong. And by doing so, put yourself into the pressure situation and still find yourself succeeding. Mental rehearsal. You visualize and vividly imagine yourself handling pressure when it hits. And by doing so, by vividly imagining that over time, it will help you to be a lot more capable and able to deal with whatever you're facing or handling at that moment in time. And then cognitive reframing or cognitive restructuring. Various different techniques you learn from CBT to NLP to help you to be able to reinterpret what you're experiencing in that moment in time, rationalizing with yourself and helping you to think this through, to change your beliefs, change your interpretations, change the way you think about whatever is going on at that moment in time, so that when the pressure hits, you're okay. And by you being okay, it means that whatever happens, you can deal with it. And that's what makes the most difference. So I hope that this has helped you with choking. Not so much that if you have a problem with that, please get the Heimlich maneuver done correctly, and please be careful to chew. Chewing is the key to everything. But if we're looking at the importance of avoiding choking under pressure, then what we need to be able to do here is to practice some of the things that we talked about in this particular episode. So if you're about to go into an interview, if you're about to go on a date, if you're about to make a presentation, if you're in any situation where you need to perform and you're worried about getting a blank, or you're worried about this or worried about that, get yourself into a position where you practice implementing what we talked about today, and it will help you to be able to be calm under pressure, or at least to handle pressure when it arrives. For now, take care, be well, may the force continue to be with you, and may you continue to believe better and to remain calm whenever you need to. Bye for now.